If I were you, I would be so ashamed of myself. I mean, I can't imagine walking around in that silly costume telling people to be against blacks and against Jews.
We believe in God, we believe in the United States of America, and we believe that God has commanded us to separate ourselves from other races. Not because we hate the other races or because we feel that we're better or worse, but because we feel it's God's commandment.
I'm Professor Judith Anderson, and today I am the face of America.
I'm Babatunde Odesanyan. Today I'm the face of America.
I'm Professor Tanya Cateri Hernandez, and today I am the face of America.
I am Robert A. Marchman, and today I am the face of America.
I'm Audrey Rowe. Today, I'm the face of America.
I appreciate the opportunity to talk about race in America because it's a very complex subject and one that, frankly, I'm immersed in every day, every minute of my life.
I grew up an Afro-Latina, Puerto Rican ancestry in New York City. I am mixed race, Black and Latina, and with that background, I have seen the ways in which, regardless of what my own personal identity has been, the reaction to me has been based on what I look like, right? And there have been attempts to limit my ability to succeed. Applying to colleges, I was told, no, some schools are not meant for you. Don't reach too high. Don't work beyond your lane.
I'm actually the daughter of two working class teenagers from St. Louis, Missouri, who barely finished high school and for whom education was critical as a way to better your lives.
I am Babatunde Odesanyan. I'm the founder and CEO of Black and Latino Filmmakers Coalition. I also am the president of African Studios, which is a production company.
Hi, I'm Professor Judith Anderson. I am a cultural anthropologist and an Afro-Latin Americanist, so I am a researcher and an educator.
My father worked multiple jobs to move us to a better neighborhood, which happened to be predominantly white. We were one of the first black families to move there. When I moved into that community, I ended up, it was at a time when things were shifting in terms of integrated schools. And even though I lived in an integrated neighborhood, I ended up being bused to another community, which was not very welcoming.
I go to a men's clothing store. I'm dressed the way I am. That's the way I dressed all my career. I'm not into business casual, frankly, just not. But I frequently have been approached by white men who've asked me, can you tell me where the men's shirts are or pants or things of that? And the first couple times it happens, you kind of laugh it off. But now I confront those individuals and I just ask them, why are you asking me that question? And the look of shock on their face when they realize that I'm not a individual who works at the store is just one of embarrassment.
My name is Tanya Hernandez, and I am a law professor, and I work at Fordham University School of Law. And I'm the author of a new book entitled Multiracials and Civil Rights, Mixed Race Stories of Discrimination. People often wonder, what can we do to end racism? And of course, that's a very complex situation. But the very first thing that we need to do, of course, on that path to eradicating racism is to acknowledge that we do still have the problem. One of the hugest battles in fighting discrimination are those who, although well-intentioned, want to feel that it's a problem of the past. And unfortunately, it is not.
One of the major things that is different for Black and Latino filmmakers is the expectation of quality performance and the expectation of audience performance. We constantly overshoot and outperform what the industry was willing to pay us for. So, that's the major issue, is to collect our own data so that we can have accurate representation on what our films actually generate revenue-wise and influence-wise.
It doesn't matter that it wasn't you that enslaved people. It does not matter that it wasn't you who invented this system of racism. You are benefiting from it by virtue of being white or white passing. So you first have to acknowledge your own culpability in that and say, okay, this is something that I could not control, but I can control how I'm going to use this white privilege or this whiteness within itself. The fragility comes from, I think, the shock of realizing that. And I think the fragility actually reflects on one level an acknowledgement of that, but also a refusal to accept it. Because it's not something pleasant. It's complicated, it's very messy, and it requires a lot of work to get over as well.
Went to the University of Missouri, where there were very few people of color. And even though we got a very good education, there wasn't a sense of really being engaged in the community. It was pretty much a classroom experience, but everything else was kind of like putting your nose against the candy store window pane. Moved to Maplewood, New Jersey, fast forward, and actually with my husband, who is Muslim. I happen to be Christian. Living in New Jersey is an interesting experience in and of itself. Many people don't realize that New Jersey is the 6th most segregated state in the United States. And within that state itself, where I live in Essex County, we are the most segregated county in that state.
So to me, this country has yet to squarely deal with the issue of race because it's a painful subject. And because of some of the gains that have taken place since the 1960s and 50s, a lot of people, whites, want to say that we've moved beyond racism and that there's been progress for people of color, and that we should just move on and look at this country as a colorblind society. But that's contrary to reality to today. And what I mean by that is that whether you're looking at educational system, whether you're looking at professional opportunities, whether you're looking at criminal justice system, race sadly pervades all those discussions. So for me, why it's important for us to discuss it is that we don't understand in this country the negative impact that it has. And frankly, in my view, we are missing the true potential of this country by not dealing with the issue. And what I mean by that is, I'm a firm believer. I've spent the better part of my career not only as a attorney who has been bringing disciplinary actions against Wall Street firms who have done things contrary to the rules, which have harmed people, the investing public, or the trust in and integrity in our marketplace. But also I've been invested in diversity and inclusion. Why? Because what we've seen is that diversity and inclusion, and this, I frankly live it at home every day in the community I live in, Maplewood, New Jersey. When you truly invest in diversity and inclusion, embrace it, not tolerate it, embrace it, there's a value add. And all people who participate in that process win. It's a win-win.
Every time you see a black film come out, look at what Black Panther did over all the other, let's look at Think Like a Man, look at Girls Trip. On and on, over and over and over again, the numbers speak for themselves, but the dialogue when you're in the production meetings, when you're meeting with the studios, is, oh, nobody's gonna watch this, nobody's gonna perform. But every time a network is going under, they go get a black show. Look at what Empire did for Fox. Look what Cosby Show did for NBC. Let's look at a whole network, UPN9, that got started with all black content. Tremendous ratings, and they got enough ratings, and then they said, okay, no more black content. Same thing with Latino market. It's like, oh, yeah, you guys can do great in Latin America, but what's the last Latino breakout film in the US? It's not because the films are not quality, it's just because there's a perception that they can get over on black and Latino producers and directors. So they can give us less money, but they know that our films will outperform what they say they're gonna do.
I think that's one of the best parts is I do not come from an academic family. I actually come from an interesting blended family. My older sister and I were adopted when we were very young from West Africa, and we grew up in the US South in the big urban center of Dallas, which is quite a diverse and international city because it's a big city. But we always loved education. That's one of the motivating factors for us coming to the US, was to be able to have the opportunity to study. Now, being in such a culturally diverse environment and being adopted by someone who was from the US culture, I had to kind of immediately learn how to adjust and how to be around different cultures. And my adoptive mother worked as a missionary as well, so we had constant exposure to people from different religious backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, racial backgrounds as well. So yeah, I've always had a lifelong love of learning, and I think I'm the only person in my family who took it all the way to a PhD. But I've enjoyed, whenever I learn something, I've always enjoyed sharing it with other people. I think that's part of the excitement of learning, is when you learn something, you want to tell somebody else about it. You want them to be educated as well, in hopes that they can also do the same for others.
I found, or they found me, I should say, an organization called the South Orange Maplewood Community Coalition on Race. So I started to work with the coalition as a volunteer, using my marketing background for my corporate training. And from that experience, I got more engaged, we got more connected, they wanted more and more of my time, and then I ended up converting that into a position, which I now hold, which is Program Director of the South Orange Maplewood Community Coalition on Race. When you talk about race, people get a little bit uncomfortable. They start to squirm and kind of look at their shoes.
Right now in this nation, we're going through a debate on guns and this whole issue of gun control. I've heard a lot of talk about the issue, but for me, it's not that complex. In that, unfortunately, I think a lot of people don't want to give up their guns, and it's not because of government. The large number of owners of guns today are not people of color, they're whites. And there's a concern about we need to make sure we're in a position to protect ourselves from this coming wave. So even in that debate, there's an issue of race that people have yet to deal with. And so I just think if we're candid, we put all of the issues on the table, understand when there's a lot of talk today about tribalism, what people need to understand at the end of the day, we're all from the same tribe, and that's the human race.
The study of racism has long been thought of as being just about those who are black and those who are white. But of course, our world history has long been much more complex than just black or white. And so I think it is useful, the emerging voices of people of all different backgrounds and ethnicities shedding light on their own histories of racial discrimination. At the same time, I think it would be misplaced to believe that the entire framework for thinking about racism that's been rooted in black versus white discrimination is antiquated. That is to say, I think there actually still is a binary, even if while we look at many more ethnicities being implicated. So that is to say, while we can look at the histories of discrimination against those who are of Asian ancestry and Latino ancestry, etc., it's still within a framework in which the world expresses discrimination in binary white versus non-white terms. And that all the work that's been done at looking at discrimination from black versus white is still very useful and illuminating for us.
that's the crazy thing. We all consume each other's content. Like we love content. You know, we will watch everything, we will consume everything, and we'll create stories that just happen to have Black and Latinos in it. But it's not necessarily a Black and Latino story. It's a human story, because you know, if you're a good storyteller, you can tell Three Little Pigs and everybody will come out and see it because it's a good story. So that's why I think that also the misconception is that everybody only watches what their race is. That's really like ignorant.
Anthropology is the holistic study of human beings, and it's split into four official subfields, right? Cultural, you have, which studies, of course, people in contemporary societies, people who are around right now. Biological, which looks at humans as a biological species. It's also known as physical anthropology. It deals with things from primatology to genetics and anything that has to do with your existence as a biological, physical human being. You also have linguistics, which looks at language as a uniquely human phenomenon. We're the only animals on the planet who have the capability for language. And then we also have archaeology, which looks at the past societies, right? It's an examination of groups that are no longer around anymore. That's the easiest way to understand it. So basically what anthropologists do is they look at the entirety of the human experience to try to understand different phenomena that are happening now or have happened in the past. I like to think of my role as an anthropologist as a cultural mediator, and I help one group understand another.
The whole issue of race is fascinating and frustrating at the same time, because we talk about it, whether it's in the United States or around the world, but we seem to be very poor at actually solving the issue. And I think that a lot of that lack of progress is based on two things from my position. One is that we lack the will to really go after it. You know, when Kennedy said we were going to put a man on the moon, we did it. You have to have that dream and be committed and not be diverted to something else. And we lack the focus. It's not something you can do in your spare time or whenever the thought hits you. You have to really be focused, put the resources there, whether they be human resources or financial resources. And because of the lack of that, we keep having the same issue, the same problems over and over again.
In the legal profession, there's a lot of discussion about the efforts to increase the number of African Americans in the profession. But, and I've said this on a panel, and I'll say it now, that is not going to change dramatically until we reach the point where whites who are in a position of power and influence look at people like me, men and women, and will consider us for something other than being a maid, a entertainer, a athlete, a criminal, and the list goes on. But you don't think of me as a doctor, as a lawyer, scientist, mathematician.
When I was doing the research about the ways in which people of mixed race ancestry are discriminated against, one of the things that I found really quite surprising were the number of cases that were filed by white parents and white grandparents of multiracial young people. And that was particularly in cases of housing discrimination. And what I saw there was that there would be, like for instance, white grandparents who would rent an apartment and think of their multiracial grandchildren as sort of not having a race, that they were just their beloved grandchildren who they wanted to shield from any kind of racial identification, because to them they weren't race, they were family. Right? So all very well intentioned. But when it came to then encountering discrimination, these white grandparents had sort of an awakening. What they discovered was that when their landlords would sort of see pictures of their grandchildren, they were no longer just sort of beautiful little young grandchildren. They were now viewed as non-white, Often children with African ancestry in their mixed race heritage would be called by negative racial epithets, which I don't care to repeat, but I think you can immediately identify. And so, what was sort of a takeaway for me with these stories that I was reading is that for these white grandparents and white parents as well, what they were learning, and I think needed to continue learning, is that no matter how much they love their children and grandchildren, regardless of race, that they had to sort of start preparing their loved ones for living in a raced world. Right? And that's not about predetermining what their racial ancestry identification should be, but about helping to make them understand that they would be perceived as non-white, and that sometimes that would come with negative reactions and connotations. So in order for their children not to be taken unawares. It is a harsh reality, but it's one that as parents and grandparents, we need to prepare our children for, unfortunately.
Go out and see different films. Go out and look for those films that may not be in your natural demographic, and just be an educated viewer, because you're cheating yourself if you don't go out and see all the best films that every race and that every genre has to offer. Because it's such a rich experience when you see something that's outside your realm, and you're captivated. There was a film called The Bucket List, and we're gonna watch The Bucket List, and and I like Morgan Freeman, and I like I think Robert De Niro's in it, but it was like this movie about these old guys. It's outside of my demographic. I thoroughly enjoyed the movie. It's one of those things that I was just like so reluctant to go see, but then I went to see it and I had a wonderful experience. So that's what we can do. We can learn to love film, learn to love storytelling, and the more we see ourselves and other people, the better off we'll be.
What's unique about the United States is that we very openly and publicly discuss issues of race, which does not happen across the globe. And this country also has a very well-known history of race. You can talk to people all across the country or all across the world, and they're pretty familiar with different very highly racialized episodes in U.S. history. Whether we're talking about the particularities of the slave system in the U.S. during the colonial era, or we're talking about the civil rights movement in the 1950s, 1960s, or we're talking about the LA riots. We have all of these very marked episodes that are globally known as well. So I think that is part of it, but we're also a society that has not shied away from these discussions, which I think is actually good and promising. If people, the first step is being willing to acknowledge that race plays a very important role in society, so that you can then kind of deconstruct it and understand what racism is and how it operates.
The coalition has developed a number of programs to combat racism and to instill integration, not just in lip service, but in reality, where you have people not just living next door to each other of different backgrounds and different races, but actually living together and sharing the best of who they are.
The issue is the uncomfortableness about talking about race, and part of that uncomfortableness is some folks don't want to acknowledge the benefits that they get from race that they're frankly not entitled to.
The politicians care about when we show up, and we don't show up during the polls. We just had a major push for a TV diversity tax credit that was co-partnered with the Writers Guild and the Directors Guild. Basically, the writing rooms for most TV shows in New York City are completely white, male. So we wanted women and minority to have an opportunity, and this tax credit would have pushed that forward. We passed it through the state assembly, we passed it through the state senate, and Governor Cuomo vetoed it. We had a tax credit for New York State to help galvanize, and the city was doing real well. He moved it all upstate to his buddies. So, and the politicians sort of fall in line with what the Speaker of the House says, what the governor says, what the mayor says. So you don't really get too much pushback on if they're pro-film, they're pro-film for big industry films. But for the small guys, we still got to fight.
We also have to recognize that what racism is. We're talking about a system. We're not talking about this one independent phenomenon. We're talking about a system that works with other interlocking systems of oppression as well. It's not just existing independently. And because racism is a system, we're all in it. So that's part of it, is acknowledging that we're all in it, and that in ways that we don't even realize, we help sustain and prolong this system of racism as well. So the complexity of the issue, there's no simple solution, but there are some very concrete steps that each individual can take to try to dismantle racism in their everyday lives.
The reality is, where we have a lot of commonalities and we are one human race, we are created with these wonderful differences. Rather than ignore or deny them, we need to embrace them. To not look at race is to basically annihilate the experiences of whole groups of people, because they have a whole different experience because of race. And then when you say, I don't notice or don't, my whole life is based on the fact or influenced by my race. So how can you tell me you don't notice when it's affecting whether or not I can get a job, where I can live, so many aspects. So don't ignore race, look at it and look at what's going on, and let's get some equity. Let's work together to come to that perfect place where it shouldn't matter, but the reality is it does. And as long as it matters, we need to acknowledge that and be intentional about changing it. Ignoring it, looking away, is what's kept us where we are today.
So we currently just finished the first annual Black and Latino Film Awards, which was a huge success. So coming off of that, we're going into production with I have a distribution deal with Amazon, and we have about 4 or 5 projects in production now. A smart comedy called Car Mom. We have a parody on Alan Jones called Media Wars. We have a project that's really special for me. It's called Burley Q's. It's about the burlesque world and the underground stripper world. So we have some really great television shows coming out on Amazon. Got some films I'm working on. I can't talk about them yet because the deal's not done.
Not only is colorblind racism not acceptable, it's incredibly dangerous as well. We need to acknowledge racism in all of its forms. And because you might not want to accept that these differences matter, it does not change the fact that they matter, and they mean life and death for many people, not just in this country, but all over the world. So colorblind racism is, it's dangerous within that sense, because there are people who are literally dying because of that. So you can sit there and say that, oh, I don't see color. You're absolutely not helping. You're actually harming individuals by that. Acknowledge these differences, and that the differences matter, and that the experiences of people of color, or I would say of these racialized individuals, absolutely matter and should be validated, and their concerns should be addressed as well.
Most people feel that they're good, honest people, and they're not racist. And a lot of what we do in our community is to sponsor what we call conversations on race, where we invite people in from different races, different backgrounds, to have candid conversations about issues. And from those conversations, we sometimes expose to ourselves those areas where we have issues. Black and white have issues around race. But until you have an awareness and own and acknowledge that, there's no way to change.